Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today on delivering apprenticeship standards. And today we're going to focus on the Business Administrator Level 3. We don't have a huge amount of time with you today, so we're going to try and cover a lot of information in a short space of time. That's me, Louise Doyle. I'm a Senior Associate with SDN, and I'll be joined a little bit later on today by our guest speaker, who is Dan Russell, who's kindly joined us from Innovate Awarding to talk specifically about the role that they're playing for endpoint assessment in Business Administrator. So as I'm sure you are well versed in by now, this is part of the Future Apprenticeships Phase 3 program, which is at the time of recording coming to its conclusion. So we have throughout the program had a range of activities. I know we've met some of you on more than one occasion at the various events. You've come to the webinars, and hopefully you will continue to make use of the apprenticeships toolkit, which we'll tell you a little bit about at the end on the resources if you haven't come across it before. So our plan for this webinar, and like I said, I appreciate it looks like there's a lot of stuff on there, but I think I know now where you want your focus and the time to be spent. So hopefully we'll get the balance of that right today. So I just want to have a quick look at an overview of the relevant standards, and that'll make more sense why I've called it that in a moment. Just a small bit again around some of the delivery model considerations. So this is just saying, okay, let's have a quick look at this standard. I know some of you will no doubt be listening to this with it in front of you, but let's just have a look at it together. And then I've got 4 areas to have some input with, and we've called it What Does Good Look Like? And it's really just trying to pull together some of the things that we hear time after time and emerge as themes that training providers want to talk about, and really for me to relay that and share that with you. But in particular, because we know it's important to you, we know you're just getting used to it, is that thinking about preparation for endpoint assessment. And it's at that point I'm going to bring Dan in, because I'm sure you'll find his input really valuable and interesting on how Innovate have gone about the role of endpoint assessment organisation for this standard. I'll then give you a bit of space to do some action planning and just finalise with those supporting resources that I mentioned earlier. The outcomes from the webinar, I won't read through all of these in detail. I'm sure I'll give you 30 seconds or so to do that. I just really want to pick out the top one. So the purpose of our webinar today is to aid your decision making about your approach to implementing the Business Administrator Standard. And it might be that you're just starting to think about that move from frameworks to standards. It might be that you've never delivered the framework and you're looking at the standard for the first time. Or it might be, as we often find, that you've started that move, but actually you just want a bit of time to reflect on some of the things that have come up so far. And the other bullet points underneath there really just support that one at the top that I've mentioned. So let's have a quick look at the relevant standards. So we're focusing on that top one today, and it's really great when you get to do a webinar and you only look at one standard, because then you can have a little bit more of a deep dive into the content of it, particularly the assessment plan. But I just wanted to make the point that there are others. So there are a number of other administrator type standards that are available that have perhaps a particular sector leaning. So in the past, where we've kind of used the old, I know it's still there, but the business administration frameworks and looked at those in lots of different contexts, the standards, of course, lead you down a slightly different route because of the nature of them being quite sectorized in the way that they're written. So this is really just a kind of putting my hand up to you and saying, yes, we look at this one, but there are others out there that you may also want to look at. And I'm sure you know, but just to reiterate, you will find the details of all of the standards and assessment plans on the Institute for Apprenticeships website. So, with Business Administrator, just a couple of factual bits of information for you. So it currently sits at funding band 7. As you no doubt will be aware, there are reviews underway of the levels of funding. So I am saying this at June 2018. So I think we've just had the latest round of funding come out, or the funding guides just come out in the last week or so. And we know that there is a review of the funding bands by the time you get to August 2018. So depending on when you're listening to this, that number might have changed. And at the moment, again, June 18, we've got 14 endpoint assessment organisations actually on the register of EPAOs. And again, let's not make the assumption everyone knows this. If you simply put into Google register of endpoint assessment organisations for apprenticeships or any ordering of those words, you will get to the register and be able to see the spreadsheet that gives you the details of all of those. And of course, Innovate is one of them, hence why they have joined us today to have the conversation. So I'm going to take you through some of the headlines from the standard itself. So all I'm doing here is lifting information that you have access to as well from the standard in the way that it's written. So you remember, if you haven't got it in front of you, at the top of most of the standards there is a brief summary of the occupation, and then it tends to go through in different orders the KSBs, so the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours that are associated with the standard, and again then some factual information. So I'm not going to cover all of it, but I am going to just pick out some of the key bits that I think are particularly relevant. So what you're seeing on your screen now is really the headline occupational summary. There's about 3 paragraphs, and I've picked this one out. The responsibilities of the role are to support and engage with different parts of the organisation and interact with internal or external customers. With a focus on adding value, the role of business administrator contributes to the efficiency of an organisation through support of functional areas, working across teams, resolving issues as requested. The flexibility and responsiveness required allows the apprentice to develop a wide range of skills. Now, I'm going to show you another bit from the same headline section, because my experience in working with so many of you is that this is causing a little bit of angst, because at the moment, of course, we don't have a level 2 business administrator type standard, and we've just got the level 3 that's there. And I understand why that's causing some of that anxiety, but I also want to challenge your thinking a little bit to say, are you absolutely sure that the level 3 standard isn't relevant for that apprentice, isn't relevant for that context? Because sometimes I think, perhaps in my experience, the level 2 has been used in framework world where a level 3 standard may be perfectly appropriate. So that extra bit that I just wanted to show you, I've cut out a bit in the middle, so please do read the whole thing in full, but it was this bit here. So business administrator is also expected to show initiative, fine, managing priorities and own time, problem-solving skills, decision-making, and the potential for people management responsibilities through mentoring or coaching others. And this was a real point of deliberation for the Trailblazer group when they were writing the standard. They were really keen and clear that they didn't want to and didn't need to limit the level 3 to people who had some kind of supervisory responsibility. So the language in that opening paragraph is really important, and then you'll see it in the way it's unpicked under the KSBs as well. So it is someone who has the potential for people management responsibilities through mentoring and coaching others. And that mentoring and coaching others doesn't mean that they have to have anyone that works for them. It could be through the mentoring or coaching peers in time. It could also be through simply the way that they engage some of those other people in the organisation to help them to think about better ways that they can fulfil their role. So there's lots and lots of illustrations where people mentor and coach that doesn't have any bearing on necessarily having other administrators around them or other or people working for them. So again, it's just my point really about keeping your mind open and the employer's mind open about whether or not level 3 is appropriate. And just the other element of that, because I know you'll be thinking this, is around the Maths and English level 2. So of course what we've got with the level 3 standard is the requirement to achieve level 2, but let's not forget that the requirement for the level 2 is they have to sit the level 2 test anyway. So all of us of course don't want to be putting people forward for tests that they might fail. That makes no sense. So actually, if we're already going for that, then is the barrier perhaps different in that we're uncomfortable about teaching at that level and we need our own CPD support to get our apprentices there? Is it something that we need to work with the employer about so they understand it more rather than actually being a true barrier, I guess is what I'm saying. We also know that it's between 12 months and 18 months long, and of course bear in mind that you cannot put people through for endpoint assessment until 12 months of learning has taken place. And the one that's been a real change in practice with the Business Administrator Standard is, of course, it doesn't have any mandated technical or occupational qualifications associated with it, and I'll come back to that in a moment. If I now briefly flip over and just mention the Business Administrator Assessment Plan, I'm not going to go into any detail on this diagram at this moment in time, because I'm going to bring in Dan later on, who will do a much better job than me of unpicking this. But what I do want to do is to say, in any assessment plan you look at, you will usually find a diagram of sorts that helps you to understand how the assessment plan knits together. And actually, as a training provider, there's lots of the assessment plan you don't need to know the detail about, because they're actually not written for training providers, they're written for the EPAOs. So look for the diagram, and that's the place to put your emphasis around what is it that I need to know in order to effectively support my apprentice to be able to get through endpoint assessment. But enough of that, because I'll come on to it a little bit later on with Dan. So let's refresh ourselves with the apprenticeship journey. So for those of you who we've met before, you will be well versed in this diagram, but in case not, so top bit there tells you a bit about the frameworks world that we have operated in for a long period of time, and at the bottom here we've got the standards and the way that they flow. So we've got some obvious changes there just when you look at the construct of the diagram. So we have this element up here which is different around designing and contracting with the employer. Initial assessment in principle is the same box, but there's some interesting things I think to unpick with that, which I'll come on to in a moment. The big change in the on and off the job qualification is this notion that we do not have any mandatory standards, mandatory calls for this particular standard that we're talking about. And of course, we need to prepare our apprentices for the gateway, which is here. And that's basically the gateway that we walk through with our apprentice when we decide, in conjunction with the employer, of course, who has the key decision, that they are ready to undertake their endpoint assessment. So we've got some obvious differences that take place in here. So for example, at the front end, there's a decision to be made about whether or not to include a qualification or not. And that's really important. It's a decision. It's not a it's in or it's out. It's about considering the value of that. And that could differ potentially between different employers. And where we've got the gateway piece here, it's about thinking about how you adequately prepare your learner, of course, to get through this point. And that's what we will unpick when we bring Dan into the conversation as well. So I'll put this all up actually on the screen instead of doing it bit by bit. We spend quite a lot of time reviewing Ofsted reports because of what I do kind of in my day job. And we pulled this slide together last year, I think, or the original version of it when we spoke at the FE Week Apprenticeship Conference, and it seemed to really resonate with people. So we've used it lots of times since, and actually I've used it when we've done some of our future apprenticeships interviews with the guys at Ofsted as well, just to try to give training providers and particularly trainers some confidence that the world is not as different as it seems at times at the moment, and actually a good apprenticeship is a good apprenticeship. So what you've got on the left hand side where the green arrow is it's telling you all of the things, in fact let me rephrase that, it's telling you the key things, not all of the things, the key things that you're likely to see from a training provider that makes good apprenticeship provision. So these are the guys who are getting good and outstanding in their Ofsted inspections. What you've got on the right hand side where the orange arrow is these are the types of words and phrases you're likely to see in an Ofsted report where things are perhaps not going as well as they should, and we have things coming through as requires improvement, or in the worst case, of course, as inadequate. And I think, let me put this into context for you. In the wider education system, give or take, about 80% of provision is good or better. When you look at apprenticeship provision, it's not that. We have 51% of our provision. In fact, let's make it easy. About half of it is requires improvement or below, and half of it is good or better. And actually that's in stark contrast to elsewhere. So you can see why Ofsted have a particular concern about how we make sure that we increase the numbers of providers that are coming through as good or better. So what I've done is I've just highlighted in bold some of the things that really stand out when I'm looking at reports that are really important that we need to get right in standards world. So that one at the top, focused initial assessment. So I'm up here on the left-hand side, focused initial assessment. I'm not saying the ones in bold aren't important, but I think they're important regardless of whether or not it's a framework or a standard. We know we need to make sure the off-the-job training is well planned. We know that we need to make sure that progress is monitored frequently and robustly. And now, of course, we're monitoring progress towards a very fixed point in time, which is the gateway. And sometimes we're monitoring progress without having qualifications included. So it does take on a slightly different emphasis. And this one, of course, is relevant in frameworks to standards, frameworks and standards, but I know it exercises the minds of our Ofsted colleagues a lot, and it is about the quality of feedback that learners receive in order to direct their learning. And over here on the right-hand side, we're likely to see things around lack of targets for learners, actually sessions not planned well enough is increasingly important, and also ongoing assessment is not rigorous enough. And some of the others are just basically the flip side of the things I've got on the left-hand side. So I'm showing you this for two reasons. One is to say, whether you deliver frameworks or standards, I truly believe a good apprenticeship is a good apprenticeship. But also there are some particular nuances that come more to the fore when you look at standards versus frameworks. And that's just the couple of bits I want to cover with you today before we just have a more specific look at preparation for endpoint assessment. So I'm going to do a quick pause for thought because I'm absolutely sure that you've had enough of my voice just for a moment. So I just want you to think about this. So just a minute or so, quick notes or in your head. When you look at that picture, that illustration I've just shown you about what does good look like, what I just want to think about is either individually or within your organisation, which of these things do you think are particular strengths for you? What do you already know that you're good at? And actually, let's be really honest with ourselves and say, but these things are a weakness. These things are a weakness for either me or my organisation. And therefore, if they're a weakness now, they're likely to be moving forward into standards. And equally, if they're a strength, it's how you capitalise on them. So which of these factors do you think are a strength, which is a weakness, and which do you think you can capitalise on where they're strengths or overcome where the weakness is? Because the move to standards actually allows you to do something better or different. So just a minute there. So I'm going to go quiet for a little while. So hopefully that's just given you a moment to think about it, and you might get a chance now to think about it more while I unravel them for you to some extent. So I'm really clear that in the space of a 1-hour webinar, we cannot possibly cover all of the dimensions that that are needed to move you from not delivering this particular standard to delivering it. But I hope that what I'm able to do is give you a little bit of food for thought about some of the things to consider. So when we look at initial assessment in standards, our view is, and it certainly seems to be shared by most of the providers we work with who are now delivering standards or well on the way to it, is initial assessment has a broader relevance than just maths or English. I know we could argue that it should have done anyway, but let's not have that argument, because that's not what today is about. It's about saying what is the best way to deliver the business administrator standard. So what we would say to you is have a think about your current approach to initial assessment. Does it allow you to baseline the knowledge, skills and behaviour of the apprentice in order to build an individualised programme of learning that gets them suitably to the gateway? does it allow you to baseline for the purpose of monitoring progress for that apprentice towards the KSBs? And finally, let's not hold this up as being the answer to everything. Let's also recognise the limitation of initial assessment process. It isn't an exact science, and we are lucky that we don't have to give that information out to anyone. It's not used to benchmark because it shouldn't be. It is very much about building the right program of learning for an individual apprentice. But it does mean you still need to think about how can we make the IA process as valid and reliable as possible, as opposed to it simply being a paper exercise that we do to tick perhaps an Ofsted box, rather than do it in order to drive the best quality of program that you can. So let me just go through those again. Initial assessment has broader relevance than just maths and English. It's not just about those. It's about baselining for an individualized program of learning, and also giving you a baseline on which you can monitor the progress of the apprentice towards the KSBs of the standard, and of course ultimately towards success at endpoint assessment, having got them successfully through the gateway. And there's also thinking about how you would use the grading profile, and I'll come back to grading when I'm with Dan. Use the grading profile to support you with some of that thinking as well, because of course we want to make sure we're stretching and challenging the learner, which I'll come on to in a moment. So just with that in mind, I've just pulled out a particular section from the Business Administrator Standard itself. And if you just look at that one there's no reason I've picked this one. It just had enough detail in to kind of pick up on. The questions to consider when you are looking at initial assessment would be, if we are to initially assess and assess on an ongoing basis the starting point and the progress of the learner in this particular one here, which is record and document production, how might we go about doing that? So how would we IA whether or not they produce an accurate record or document? How would we IA, or would we even want to, around making recommendations for improvement? And so on, when you look at the detail in there. And I think it's a really interesting and useful exercise to go through that debate with colleagues about how would we know those things. So for example, if your method of initial assessment is about getting the apprentice to do a self-review of that, how accurate is that likely to be? So it's not that it's an invalid method, but it does mean that you're not looking at it from any other direction. There would also be the consideration of at what time do you do it? Because if you do it at the very, very, very beginning of the program, what evidence source would you have to know whether or not the learner can do those things? So there's kind of two questions for me in there for you to consider. One is, what are the methods by which, or the method that we think is appropriate to initially assess the learner? And when is it the best time to do that, so we can make sure any consideration we're making is as accurate as it possibly can be. There are always limitations to that, as I said before, but the exercise itself, it is still valid to go through if you want to be able to demonstrate that progress is being made to both the employer and to the learner. And the same applies for other standards, but it just so happens we're looking at Biz Administrator today. So the second bit for me is around the designing of the training. And again, we could do a whole day, and often do whole days training and development around this. So this is just, again, some bullet points. And these are considerations that other providers have come up with when we have worked with them in collaborative sessions to consider how they might want to develop this standard. And a lot of the purpose of the webinars is basically to share that with you. So the considerations that they've said is, of course, it's highly likely an employer, whilst wanting an input, will recognise your expertise in building a suitable program which can be adapted to suit. So contrary to sometimes the word bespoke being bandied around, that every employer's apprenticeship program will be bespoke, I doubt that very much, actually. I think there will be a core of the way that you want to deliver it, and you will be giving them the opportunity to flex and adapt that accordingly. So, and I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that that's the wrong way to look at it so far. The ILP is absolutely key, and it mustn't be a paper exercise if you are to do this well. And again, when we work with providers, sometimes they're very reflective in saying, actually, this isn't an issue with frameworks to standards movement. It's simply that our ILP approach and our reviewing with employers approach actually isn't as strong as it ought to be. So whether it's frameworks or standards, we really ought to review that anyway. A question that is often subject to debate, and I appreciate it can be a spiky debate at times, is, so that's why I've written it as a question, is if you are absolutely sure that if you are using a pure one-to-one training approach, that it is absolutely the best thing for an apprentice to make that happen. So I suppose the question is what does that apprentice lose out on by not having the opportunity to interact and learn with other apprentices? If they're only working with one person from your organisation, what does that give in terms of benefit, but equally what might be some of the downsides of that as well? And thinking about how you use technology to support with that. So it's not about bringing them into a classroom, but it is about using the resource that's available to you very easily now, like the one we're on today, to think about how you might engage them in learning in a different way. Next one down, plan to the standard, not to the assessment plan. As my colleagues at SDM will know, this is a bit of a bugbear for me, and I have no reason for it being a bugbear. I should say that. I simply look at other parts of the education system and say, let's not make that mistake. And what I mean by this is, let's not get into the habit of teaching to the test, that we get so caught up in the content of the endpoint assessment, we lose sight of the bigger picture of what's in the standard, and also what it is the employer wants from that standard. So plan your training to what's in the standard with an eye on the assessment plan, not the other way around. Plan to challenge whatever the start point of the apprentice is. So the grading boundaries are important and they're useful, and I would be working really closely with my EPAOs to think about how the grading boundaries have been interpreted by them and how you can use them in your delivery to help to motivate and stretch the apprentice. So I actually really like the notion of grading. Only time will tell if it works out in the way that everyone who put it in hopes it would be, but I've certainly seen some anecdotal evidence that the training providers and apprentices have liked the concept of it, because it allows people who are able to exceed to demonstrate that they can do that. Equally, of course, what we're not trying to do is make everyone get to the point of getting a distinction, because some of our apprentices will never be at that level, so it's always relevant to what their starting point is. The next one we kind of touched on before with IA. How are you going to know if your apprentice is making progress from their start point? And actually, without any form of initial assessment, I would be interested to see how any provider could effectively do that. And the last one, I know Dan will touch on this a little bit, is, and there's no right or wrong answer to this, it's about you and your provision and the way you want to drive it. But when is the best time, and actually one of the best ways to think about preparation for endpoint assessment? And for lots of us, this is a kind of try it out and see what works and review it time. And that's one of the key deliberations that you no doubt will want to think about. And then designing training, final point for me, there's really no need to panic. And I'm seeing too much panic, particularly from trainers, not from managers so much, but from trainers who are saying to me and to our colleagues throughout the Future Apprenticeships programme, I'm really worried about this because I've actually never had to design training before. My role is to assess. So I know that concern is much bigger than I can ever say in a webinar and can certainly ever say on one slide. So some of that is about people CPD and confidence and training as opposed to assessment. But there's just that basic bit for me when I unpick it with people, that they do know how to do this and they have done it and can illustrate it. It just seems sometimes like a bit of a mountain to climb at the moment. So basic 4 steps. Have we described the intended learning outcome in the form of a verb? So a learning activity, its object, so the content of it, and specifying the context, and a standard that the apprentice needs to get to. Now, let me just flip on to the next slide here. Actually, when a standard is written well, it does that for you. So you'll see with the one I showed you earlier, it is written in that format. I'm not saying they all do that, but in this particular standard, it does do that. So it's kind of giving you, number one, Number 2, create a learning environment using teaching learning activities that address that verb and are therefore likely to bring about the intended outcome. I know it takes time and I know you guys are busy, but that is the exciting and creative and enjoyable bit of our role, about how we think about the most interesting ways to get across what's needed in order to achieve the learning outcome. So enjoy the process of doing that, I guess is what I'm saying. Number 3, what are the assessment tasks that you're going to build in, and actually that they also contain the same verb, thus enabling you to judge if and how well an apprentice's performance is meeting the criteria. So basically, when you look at initial assessment, again, I'm just going to move between slides again. The standard writes the initial assessment for you. It actually more or less writes what it is that you would want to assess them against. What it doesn't do is necessarily tell you the right way, nor should it, the right way to do that in order to inform progress. But it does take you some way along that journey. And the last one, considering those judgments in relation to the grading criteria for the EPA, which I won't go on about anymore because I've mentioned it already. And as I said, I'm sure Dan will tell us a little bit more about it from the way Innovate have interpreted it. So, without further ado, let me get Dan to open up his mic, and I'll just do a quick test to make sure everything's working, and then he and I can have a conversation which kind of talks us a bit through preparing for endpoint assessment. Dan, are you there?
Hi Louise, yes I'm here.
Hello Dan, thank you very much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So Dan, in all of that stuff that you've had to listen to me for in the background for the last half hour, is there anything in there that that particularly kind of stands out for you in terms of how you're approaching this as an EPAO, or anything actually that you disagree with?
Well, nothing that I disagree with at all. I would just go back to where you said about the assessment plans and how actually they are written for EPAOs, and I'd say I really do agree. You know, that they're not there for, you know, the actual assessment. They're here for us, for Innovate as an EPAO, to sort of design our materials and assessment resources to support the training providers.
That's great.
So yeah, I completely agree with that point you made.
Fab, thank you. So I'm going to put that diagram back up on the screen now, which hopefully you can see that at your end as well, Dan.
Yes.
And what would be really good is I'll ask you kind of 4 or 5 questions and maybe some sub stuff underneath in the time that we've got. But what I particularly want to pick up on is a bit about Innovate's approach to thinking about how you operationalise this. And then let's just have a chat about the 3 different elements that are in the assessment plan.
Okay, that's fine. So, I mean, the first approach that we did was actually take the assessment plan and kind of break it down, because you know that's kind of like the basic sort of foundation, obviously from where we are all working. And the first thing we did was develop our specification.
Yep.
And that kind of leads us on to be able to do everything else. So the specification is basically the assessment plan, and obviously you've gone through sort of the modules like the record and document production, where we can actually create assessable criteria with those, you know, assessment verbs that make it easy to then assess, but also it kind of gives that clarification to sort of training providers and employer providers, so they actually know what they need to deliver. And obviously it helps, you know, the EPAO to then be able to go, right, this is how we are going to assess it and this is what we are looking for.
Yeah.
And obviously we'll talk about grading later on, but it leads into sort of the grading amplification that's provided in the assessment plan. Obviously this assessment plan is quite good because it does provide that. So it enables you to actually work out sort of the grading and sort of differentiate between that pass and distinction quite nicely.
So, and Dan, where I've got the 3 kind of circles on here, what the one in green is, and just for our audience, the bit in blue is basically the role of the training provider, summarised from an EPAO's point of view. The bit in orange is the gateway, which is that very firm line in the sand that an employer ultimately makes the decision around. And then the bit in green is what you guys do. But what we've got with business admin, of course, is that there's some things that happen in the blue bit that have a bearing on what you guys do in the green bit. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, obviously there is a portfolio which links into the assessment of the interview. Yep. So that's key. And I think it's, you know, you have to work in partnership with your EPAO. to ensure that, the right requirements are being met. So although, just to clarify, the portfolio itself, is not assessed, and that's very clear within the assessment plan. However, it is the sort of the foundation and the building blocks for that interview. And it's something that the EPA will need to read through and review a month before that actually interview starts. So it kind of does tailor the questions and the understanding. So working together to make sure that the portfolios are correct and cover everything that it needs to means that the apprentice has a better chance of getting those higher grades and being able to even pass, because everyone knows what's involved.
Yeah.
So I think it's in the assessment plan does say sort of like a minimum of 8 to 12 pages. But actually, if you think of, the fact that there are 17 modules within the interview that need to be covered, that portfolio, which is going to summarize the best of that apprentice's work, will actually be a lot larger than that. So just making sure that everything kind of fits together and it's the relevant work and it's obviously the relevant sort of learning that's undertaken and then evidenced.
Sure. Okay, so let's walk through each of them. I'll actually come back to the portfolio one, because I think there's quite a lot of interest in that, isn't there? So tell me about the knowledge test in the first instance. I'm presuming because of the way the diagram's done, the knowledge test happens first?
Yes, well, it's sort of highly suggested within the assessment plan that it's completed first. So, I mean, that is what we would recommend anyway to all of our sort of provider partners, because if there is an issue, so if, for example, an apprentice were sort of unfortunate enough to fail, the report they would get back would enable that kind of tailored revision to ensure that they are able to then sort of sit again and achieve and pass. I think so. And obviously, apprentices are sort of renowned for being quite nervous when it comes to tests. So yes, I would definitely sort of recommend doing that first. I think the assessment plan is quite detailed when it comes to sort of the assessment method. So it does tell you, it's a 60-minute test. It's a 50 question equally weighted with 4 potential answers in each. So, I mean, it kind of allows us to be able to sort of design that quite nicely. And obviously it tells you the modules that need to be covered within sort of the knowledge test. So there are sort of 6. So 6 out of the 21 modules will be covered in the knowledge test. So, I mean, I think that's why it relates to the 20% of the overall grade.
Yeah, I'm with you. And the knowledge test, how would the apprentice sit that? Is it online?
Yeah, so the way we've developed it, we've got online tests.
Okay.
They can be sat offline in the sense of if there is no signal, so you download the test onto the laptop beforehand. So it's got that flexibility within there. Obviously because it's a multiple choice test, so the return on the results is quite quick. And that enables us obviously to give that feedback to the providers.
Okay. Who invigilates it, Dan?
It's invigilated sort of by the providers. Obviously, there's the requirement, obviously, that it's not invigilated by the on-program assessor.
Yes.
But yeah, it's invigilated by providers.
Okay.
And I think that there's also the added benefit there of it's not this, this scary EPAO coming out with their endpoint assessor and they're meeting sort of like probably the first time and actually, testing them. So I think it kind of reduces the nerves for the apprentice there as well.
Sure. And the question that will immediately go through people's minds is, are there any mock tests that they can work on? Is that something that you as an EPAO provide to support the preparation for endpoint assessment?
Yes, definitely. So it will vary depending on EPAO. So I can only really speak for Innovate. But yeah, we have sort of two. So we have a practice test, which is a very short kind of test, which is just to familiarize the apprentice with the software so that they're able to navigate properly without having that to sort of confuse and worry them. And then there is a full mock test, which has got the full 50 questions, has to be completed in 60 minutes. And the questions are akin to those that are going to be within the live test. So, I mean, I've always recommended to sort of our provider partners to make sure that they use that as that pre-gateway readiness check. So if the apprentice can pass, or even get the distinction, that's great, they're ready. But obviously, if they can't pass, then that's a clear indication that there is additional learning that needs to take place. And because of the way it's been built, it will tell you sort of which of the criteria and which of the modules that the apprentice needs that support with because they weren't able to answer correctly. So you can actually then tailor that additional learning and that revision support. So I think that's sort of key to making sure and that preparation for endpoint assessment.
That's great, thank you. So let's move on to the two bigger ones, which are taking up 80% of the mark. So we started to talk about the portfolio-based interview there before, and you said something really important, Dan. You said the portfolio is about a reflection of their best work. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so obviously, you know, I think probably like you, I've worked in sort of apprenticeship delivery in the past, and we know a portfolio consists of everything that the apprentice has completed over sort of that on-program journey. But I think it's key to remember with this, you know, we want to see the best of their work. We don't need to see sort of the drafts and sort of the half-completed work. It's about them showing us the best of their capability, because this is where the apprentice gets to stand up and be very proud and kind of say, this is what I can do, and this is what I can achieve, and this is what I am capable of. And we don't want to obviously that to be sort of filtered down by sort of the work that they sort of have completed and that sort of needs those improvements. So it's about sort of taking what they've done on program for sort of like that minimum of 12 months, getting and collating the best of that, and then submitting that as sort of a package for the endpoint assessor to be able to review, ready to then have that kind of tailored interview around, you know, everything that the apprentice has done, so they can sort of meet the requirements for this assessment method.
Well, one of actually, when I've spoken to one of your colleagues in the past, and we were having an interesting discussion about how much support and preparation is too much. And portfolio is an example of that. About actually, the risk is you lead the apprentice so much down the route of what one should look like that it stops becoming their work. And in EPA world, that's a really big deal. I appreciate it's not being marked in its own right, but it has a bearing on what they then say in interview. So how much, when a provider says to you, can you show us an example of a good portfolio, what's Innovate's response to that? How do you deal with that?
Okay, it will vary on the standard, really. There are some where the portfolio is assessed directly. There are some where it's just linked like this one. So with this one, I mean, there isn't it's sort of an exemplar project, portfolio that we could share at the moment. It's obviously a very kind of new standard in terms of some of the other ones we deliver. So that isn't there. It is something that we are kind of looking at. I think the fear is that if you give sort of an exemplar sort of a piece of evidence, you then end up with 200 versions of the same thing.
Exactly.
So I think it would be more around sort of snippets and samples around sort of, you know, parts of different modules to help kind of give sort of best practice. But again, you know, we've kind of got that within our specification where we kind of tell you, you know, what are the key themes within the modules, what kind of examples of evidence that you could be using, whether, you know, from the workplace, whether that, you know, reviews, one-to-ones, you know, email conversations, you know, documents that they've created. It's kind of all of those things. So it's kind of there in a sense, but it's kind of not been drawn together. But, you know, there is that fear that, you know, the more you provide, the more that same version you just get repeated again and again.
Yeah, it's we get back into my little concern over the teaching to the test scenario, don't we? That it becomes about that as opposed to about them being able to do the job that they're doing the apprenticeship for. Exactly,
and I think you have to remember with this standard, it's quite broad. Obviously, the role of a business administrator is quite broad anyway. So I think it's kind of taken into account that, you know, an exemplar distinction level portfolio from one apprentice would not fit for someone else because they're in a completely different role. And I think that could cause that confusion of, oh, I need to create this, but I can't do that because my role won't allow me. But actually they're capable of doing something different, but equally as good. It relates to their role. And I think it's key to remember it has to relate to that individual apprentice's job role.
Yeah, and actually that point I was hopefully was able to illustrate early on about the way that the language of the people management, the mentoring and coaching and positioned is a good illustration of that. You know, if you're in a big admin team, then I see exactly how that's very apparent how you could do that. If you're not, that doesn't mean to say that the standard isn't valid for them.
No, not at all. So, I mean, you know, it is that obviously the potential to manage it would be great. But when you're coaching and mentoring someone, So you don't need those managerial responsibilities. For example, you could just be asked to support someone who's new within the business.
Yeah.
Or, there's sort of a lot of places do job sharing, so they've got that kind of exchange of knowledge and skills, which can happen quite naturally there anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's something that kind of needs to be a concern. I think it will happen quite a lot. It's obviously something to be aware of, that the apprentice will need to be at that level where they can share their best practice. Obviously, that is what we're aiming for anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interview itself, Dan, that will be done with the EP, your independent assessor, face to face or remotely?
We've taken a very flexible approach. So we offer remote and face-to-face, and it is completely dependent on what the apprentice wants. Obviously, there might be some requirements from an employer's perspective, but it will be that initial contact that our endpoint assessor will have with the apprentice when they're planning in all the assessments. They will offer that, and it will be up to the apprentice to decide what they would prefer. So some apprentices will not want to do it remotely. And some will just only want to do it face to face. So it's completely up to the apprentice at the end of the day.
Okay, and the interview for this one, is it just a one-to-one interview, Dan, or are there other people in the room?
It's just a one-to-one interview. I am asked by sort of our partners, can the assessor they've had on program be there? Can their manager or mentor be there? And there's nothing specific within the assessment plan that say they can. It's just there is that concern of, there's an additional person, so that could create more nerves for the apprentice. And also what happens when the apprentice maybe doesn't know a particular answer and then someone else starts answering for them. It's then not the apprentice's work, so it then kind of creates that area of confusion. So I would always kind of be working towards the assumption of, let's get it so that the apprentice is confident to have that interview, so they don't need anyone, because it just resolves so many potential issues that could arise, which obviously we don't want to, because it would just affect the apprentice's overall grade otherwise. Sure.
That's great. So one more question on the portfolio, actually, Dan, if I may. So on program up here in the green box, we've got the reference to that portfolio of their best work being built up. How does the training provider get the portfolio to you?
Okay, so we've got a few different options. The one that we want to use is being given sort of limited access to the e-portfolio system, the provider. So the endpoint assessor can access that and just do it sort of remotely over sort of a limited period of time. The second option is for that to be uploaded to our endpoint assessment software, EPA Pro. So you can upload sort of like a zip file of all the evidence. We really don't want to go down the route of having things sent in sort of special recorded delivery. That just creates so many issues. But I mean, those are the two main ones that we're working towards. But it is, again, trying to be flexible and work with different requirements.
That's great, thank you. So last but not least, we've got a project, an improvement-based presentation, which again has a lot of marks attached to it. So tell us a bit about how that's going to work.
Okay, so I mean, again, the assessment plan is quite detailed with this assessment method, which is really good. So they say that the project can be completed from month 9 of being on program. Okay. Obviously, before that period, it's all about sort of the teaching and the learning to enable the apprentice to be able to understand the requirements. The project management is a module within the standard anyway. So from month 9, they can be working on that. And I think we get a lot of questions around, what can we include? And I think it's really difficult to say that, because obviously different providers work with different employers. So the job role will be different. And obviously this administrator, even within one organization, is very varied. So I think it's just a case of kind of using the resources that we've got to kind of go through and say, well, these are the requirements. So again, there's 12 modules that are covered within the project improvement presentation. So just making sure that actually those modules can be covered, and it's the scope that's big enough. But actually, instead of providing specific examples of developing relationships with stakeholders or something like that, it's about kind of going, the project just needs that kind of scope where the apprentice can go away and actually manage this project. But we're aware that there will be apprentices who probably haven't got that authority to manage projects on their own. So it's about kind of them being given that kind of support to in essence, manage it, but have someone there, like a mentor or manager, who they can go to and just double check and confirm any decisions before they're implemented. So just because they've got that on-program support, really, but obviously as long as they own and are responsible for the project, then actually it's fine.
And you're saying it covers when we're talking about the module breakdown, of course we're talking about which of the KSBs are assessed under which of the assessment methods, because they can't be assessed multiply across more than one assessment method. Does that make sense in the way I worded that?
Yes, sorry. So I'm just using Innovate terminology. So instead of like units in the old, we've called modules like one of them is like value of their skills. We've kind of said, okay, well that is a module. So there's a range of criteria per each of the Innovate modules, and there's 12 that the assessment plan says that will be covered by this presentation.
Yeah, I've got you. So it's basically driven ultimately by the department in saying you've got to what's said to the Trailblazers group, just for the purpose of our audience, is the Trailblazer groups are given the direction that they need to now be very clear on what's being assessed under each of the different methods, because actually in some of the early standards and assessment plans it actually just wasn't stated. So that's caused some issues, of course, for individual EPAOs, but actually where it really causes issues about consistency between EPAOs, and that certainly got better by the point this standard was published, I think. So as you say, it's much clearer what needs to be covered in which element. So with the project and presentation, Dan, is it that they are being marked on the project, or is it the way that they're presenting it that they're being marked on?
So again, it is the presentation, so that's going to be assessed on here. So obviously the project improvement has to be at a substantial level to enable the information within that presentation to kind of cover everything and obviously then achieve the standard. So again, it does have to be a good sort of project with a large scope in essence. But yeah, it is the presentation. And again, that's broken down into two parts. So you've got the actual presentation itself, which they've been allocated 10 to 15 minutes, and then a question and answer session, which again is 10 to 15 minutes. And that just enables the endpoint assessor to be able to kind of dig deeper into any of the elements that the apprentice has kind of skipped over and not fully answered, or if they've missed something or explained something in a way that hasn't been fully interpreted. So it's just giving the apprentice then time to actually show that their full capability. You know what it's like. If you're given 10 to 15 minutes to present something you've been working on for
absolutely
5 months, you're kind of struggling with everything and remember everything that you've done and actually how good you are. I think this is again a situation where we're looking for the apprentices to kind of tell us how good they are and always kind of be quite arrogant. It's very anti-English, really, isn't it? But actually we want you to stand up and say how good I am.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your point around the portfolio. It's a very different world to perhaps what some of our trainer assessors have been used to, which is around sharing of what I've done, as opposed to just sharing of the bits that I've done really, really well.
Yes.
The difference between using them they're just for different purposes, aren't they? And I think that's what the introduction of endpoint assessment has teased out perhaps more than we've had in the past with some of the way apprenticeships have been driven. So Dan, tell me one more thing. So what if I do really well in the knowledge test and then I do really well in the interview, but I don't do very well at all in the presentation?
Okay, so you need to hit the minimum pass grade, which is 60% in each of the assessment methods to be able to pass. But as long as say if you hit that 60% in your presentation, then there's obviously the weighting that's involved with the grading. So you may still be able to get that sort of distinction if you do incredibly well in the other elements.
Okay.
So I think it does give that flexibility. We understand that an apprentice might have a bad day or they might be particularly nervous about doing the presentation or the test, for example. So we know nerves can be a factor. So I think it's flexible enough to allow for some nerves, but actually the overall quality of the work will be able to sort of guide the apprentice and help them reach the highest potential that they can.
What if I do really, really, really badly?
So if you did fail, so then that would need to be reset.
Yep.
You know, it doesn't matter which assessment method it is that you fail, you would need to resit it.
Okay.
And, you know, we don't sort of say that's a limiting factor and stop you from progressing and doing the other ones. You know, I think there has to be some sort of common sense involved where, you know, if the apprentice sits, say, the knowledge test and they come up with a 5% overall, we would kind of be looking at that and with the provider and kind of say, okay, if this is what they're achieving here, the rest of the work up to par to be able to get them to pass. We don't want the apprentice to fail multiple times.
Sure.
It's obviously that morale that's going to affect them. So it's just kind of, you know, saying actually, are they ready? But obviously with the supporting material that we've got in place, that should not be an issue. But yeah, it's worth knowing. I guess just to make sure that, but yeah, you would have to reset that one. You'd only need to reset the one you failed.
Okay.
Not all of them.
Okay.
And yeah, you can just reset it, and there's no sort of limiting factor here. So if you were to fail one, I know in some standards it says you can only then get a pass.
Sure.
Nothing within this assessment plan that says that. So you are still able to get that distinction.
Okay. So just to summarize that, because again, it's different in different assessment plans. If you fail any element of this one, which of course we hope apprentices don't, they just have to resit that one. They don't have to resit the whole assessment, the whole of the endpoint assessment. And even if they do fail that one element, they've still got the option to be able to resit it and ultimately get a higher grade than pass. They're not limited.
Yes, that's exactly correct.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. So let me just quickly move on a slide before I know I'm taking up too much of your time here, but let me ask you one more thing. So the grading criteria, I've lifted what's in the assessment plan, but I know that you guys at EPAs have to do a lot of work to get this right, to be able to operationalize it and make sure that your assessments are valid and consistent and reliable. So can you just talk us through a little bit about the grading in the way that it's applied for this standard?
Okay, so I mean, first of all, they do give a maximum number of marks per assessment. So the test is 50 marks, and then the presentation and the interview are 100 marks each. So obviously that's a maximum of 250 marks. And then obviously we've used the percentages of 20 and 40% respectively to then work out a sort of a conversion factor, which then uses the marks allocated and then the percentages and the weighting sort of evenly. To distribute them. So it's quite complicated, so I don't want to go into too much detail.
No, sure.
But that's how it's done. And also within the assessment plan, it's in Annex 1, where it actually goes through each of, sort of the standard requirements with each of the Innovate Word modules. It gives you that kind of the grading with the fail pass distinction for each of them. So, you know, we're quite lucky with this standard really that we've got that. It's not there for all of them, so we are quite lucky. So I will sort of thank the Travelings Group for that. So we've got that. So that's used obviously then to differentiate between, okay, well, how many marks do we allocate for that, whether it's a pass or a distinction or, you know, a fail potentially. So it's used that way. So it in some ways it's quite complex working out that conversion factor. But in other ways it's quite straightforward in the sense they've given us what they're expecting as a minimum for a pass or a distinction.
And that's really good guidance actually for the training providers, which is to have a look at that annex, because as you say, in some of the earlier plans there wasn't a requirement to do that. It only came in, you know, quite late into last year that the Trailblazer groups had to provide that degree of detail. And although we know that the assessment plan is mainly written for you guys, actually that annex for this standard is very helpful for the training providers in thinking about how they stretch their learners to meet an appropriate level of grading for their apprentice, because often we're asked that, well, how will we know if they're going to, if we're aiming for a distinction, for example? But this standard, as you say, does give some detail on that.
Yes, I mean, it's giving you your delivery requirements as a minimum for that pass, but yeah, you've got that stretching, that dig deeper element to be able to then show those that can and want to are being able to achieve that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I've got one more question for you, Dan, if I may. So in terms of preparing, so I'll just flick back to the slide before. So in terms of preparing for the endpoint assessment, I know you work with a lot of training providers. We're not saying any way is better or worse than any other, but what examples have you seen about how the training providers are going about preparing for endpoint assessment? Are they doing it throughout the program, or are they doing it in different ways to that?
It's a lot of different ways, actually. I mean, so I'll just go back. I did raise a point earlier on, so I'm repeat myself, sorry.
Oh,
But the knowledge test, the mock, that is key. I don't think we can emphasize that enough. If they can pass that knowledge test, the mock, then they are ready for that knowledge test assessment. And you know that what you've been delivering has sort of sunk in. They've retained that knowledge.
Yeah.
When it comes to the interview and the presentation, I think a lot of providers are kind of a bit wary of, well, how do we prepare the learners not only with the knowledge that they need, but for the skills required for those assessment methods. So we've got sort of different approaches. So some partners we work with have decided to do a training session 1 month, and then at the next month they'll do the first 5 or 10 minutes either an interview around what was taught before to obviously make sure that that knowledge has been retained, but also embed those interview skills. And then the next month they might ask them to do a 5 to 10 minute presentation on what they've learned the previous month. So they're embedding them throughout, and it's very kind of holistic with preparing for functional skills, the knowledge, skills and behaviours within the standard, and also those assessment methods. We've got other sort of provider partners that do the same approach but on a quarterly basis. So every sort of 3 months they will ask for an interview or a presentation based on everything that's been delivered in the last 3 months. So again, embedding that. And then we've got some who either do a mixture of that or just do, say it's on a 12-month on program delivery. They would do 10 months of delivery of learning, and then 2 months sort of revision with mock assessments. And quite a lot of our providers are very keen with that. So what we've done is develop some mock resources which are very similar to what our EPAs would use, but will enable the provider to do a realistic mock, asking very similar questions against the same criteria that they will get in the live assessment. So actually you are preparing the apprentice, and then they've got a rough idea as to what's going to be the outcome, hopefully. Obviously that would be graded by the provider. We won't be involved in that, but at least it enables that apprentice to know, actually, okay, I'm weak in these areas, or I got really nervous for the first 10 minutes of the interview, so actually I need to make sure that I work on those skills, or that area, that module that I was covering, say on IT, I really wasn't sure, I didn't have enough examples to give, so they can use that. So there's lots of different ways, but I think having those mock resources do really support and help.
That's brilliant. Thanks. I know I said I was only going to ask you one more thing, but I've got one other to ask you. And it is, so who gets the certificate? So I've passed and I've done brilliantly in my endpoint assessment. Where is my certificate going?
Okay, so once the EPAO sort of claim that completion, and they then inform the ESFA will send the certification directly to the employer. So the EPAO and the provider don't actually receive that. It goes straight to the employer, and then it's their responsibility to ensure the apprentice gets that.
Enough said about that, eh?
Don't need to go on too much about that. We'll see how that works.
Time will tell. Dan, that's brilliant. Thank you so much for your input today. It is very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So I've got a couple more bits to show you guys before we close today, and it really is only a couple of bits. You've been very patient with me today. So let me just show you this. So I know that some of you will be in frontline roles, so this might be something to pass on to your quality managers, but we'll give you the slide content, but just something to think about for us, and it's this, is just consider whether or not your current quality assurance mechanisms and approaches are fit for purpose. We have a really strong view, as we would at Mesmer and SDN, because we're quality management people, but is around the importance of the IQA role is crucial, and in particularly in something like business administrator, where you might have different models of the way that it's being delivered, some with calls and some without. So there's some different things to look at. Your IQAs are absolutely crucial to this, and we hope that as you get a chance to look at this diagram and just walk through whether or not you think that you are adequately covering all of the different elements, reminding ourselves about what it is that good apprenticeship provision looks like. So just unraveling that with a few bullet points. Have you, so from a QA point of view, some things that you might want to be asking are, when a qualification has been selected, why was it selected or why was it not? Was the employer involved in that, or are we just creating a vanilla model and we're not giving the employer the option, which is not in the spirit of the way that we should be delivering these? Quality of portfolio aligns with the expectations of the EPAOs. That's crucial, and hopefully Dan has been able to illustrate for you there why that's so important. The role that you play in assuring the work in the portfolio is undertaken by the apprentice. So although with business administrator it's not being marked, so it has less emphasis, it is still important, of course, because they've got to be able to own that material when they get to interview. Ensuring that there is sufficient evidence to support presentation of the project. The apprentice is challenged in line with grade boundaries as you see appropriate. So remember that Annex 1 that Dan told you about. Making sure that the gateway requirements are met. Thinking about whether or not you're capturing the time predicted and the actual time that your apprentices are getting to gateway, which is a new metric, of course, which we haven't had to deal with in the system before. And there's lots of others in there I could think of as well. But they were just, you know, getting you considering why things might be different, because I know at times we haven't necessarily thought there's anything different for our quality people, but the reality is there absolutely is. And the final bit for me is just to say, just remembering good provision is good provision. It isn't really so different, but there are different things coming to the fore. So I suspect we're going to start to see language in Ofsted reports which refers to the quality of the preparation for endpoint assessment, making sure that the initial assessment is broad enough to cover the KSBs within the standard, for example. So it might be a useful discussion and debate to have in your own organisation about where are you at on the things that are on here, but also what do you think is going to start to feature as we see the volumes in standards starting to increase over the coming years. And the final slides from me. So I'll leave this one actually on the screen as we close off today. There's another one behind it, but you'll get that because I'm sure you'll be able to download the slides as well from ETF or from the apprenticeship portal. The main one for us is always to say futureapprenticeships.org.uk. It's where you will find all of the support material from Future Apprenticeships that's been built up over the last 4 years. And of course, the Institute for Apprenticeships website is on there as well, where you would be able to search for all the standards. So thank you very much for listening to the webinar. I hope you found it useful. If you need to ask any further questions around it, then my email address is louise@strategicdevelopmentnetwork.co.uk. That's louise@strategicdevelopmentnetwork.co.uk. And just a quick thank you again to Dan from the team at Innovate for joining us and telling us a bit about what they've had to do today as well. Thanks everyone. Bye bye.